in this period, I'm the chair of our Environmental Funders Network. And as you probably read in our introduction, this is the first of a series of webinars that our network wants to provide to our participants. Why with these webinars? Our network normally organizes 2 meetings per year, one in autumn in Brussels, mainly concentrated on European issues and providing opportunities to meet interlocutors from the European Commission, the Parliament, or the environmental NGOs based in Brussels. And another meeting in spring, each year in a different country, trying to deepen the main environmental problems of this specific nation and the answers that are provided by the philanthropy besides the state in question. Due to the coronavirus, of course, it was impossible to hold the meeting foreseen in April in Switzerland. And so, as a reaction to the physical distance imposed by COVID, we decided to maintain at least some opportunities of virtual networking within the group and to provide space for a joint discussion among the funders on relevant themes for us. So we are trying to select some topics able to provide a good understanding of the present situation and above all, a different angle from which we could look at it. So this time we would like to investigate social aspects connected to environmental pollution and in particular how air pollution or extreme temperatures may affect the different groups of the population in a different way. So the question is whether the most vulnerable people, the elderly, those in poor health, the lower socioeconomic groups, are also the most affected targets of environmental hazards. If yes, if the answer is yes, as I think we saw also in the coronavirus crisis on health issues, we should consider the role of policies to counterbalance this situation. And I mean by this, economic or fiscal policies more than environmental ones. In this scenario, as members of philanthropic organizations dealing with environmental issues, we have also to interrogate ourselves about our role to better cope not only with the present emergency crisis, but also with the even more relevant climate crisis, and to suggest effective solutions. In order to boost the discussion today, we need the help of an expert, and that's why we have with us Aleksandra Kazmierczak, lead author of the report Unequal Exposure and Unequal Impacts, Social Vulnerability to Air Pollution, Noise and Extreme Temperatures in Europe. Aleksandra is a climate change adaptation expert at the European Environmental Agency, specializing in urban and societal aspects of adaptation. She also works on issues related to environmental health inequalities, and that's an important topic for us today. And prior to joining the agency in 2017, Aleksandra was a researcher in human geography and spatial planning in the UK at the University of Manchester and the University of Cardiff. So I stop here my introduction and remind that after Aleksandra's speech, there will be plenty of time for comments and interventions from you all, and that the discussion will be moderated by my colleague Matteo Barbato, who is with me today. So the floor is yours, Aleksandra. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much, Elena. First of all, Many thanks for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially as in my sort of daily job, I don't often interact with the philanthropic sector, so it's really good to be here. Thank you very much. In the next few minutes, I would like to present the findings of a report published last year by the European Environment Agency on socio-economic inequalities and how they are linked to environmental issues. So let me try and share my screen. Is this working?
Yes, it was working before. Yes, it's working.
Yeah, okay, okay, thank you. Okay. So just to give you a bit of an introduction about the European Environment Agency. We are an agency of the EU, and our mandate is to provide objective and robust information on the environment to support the policy making, not just in Brussels, but also in the countries, and to provide the information to the general public as well. We are a network organization, which means that we are closely working with 38 countries in Europe. We lost the UK as one of our collaborating countries. And we are working with many institutions, the national agencies on environment, but also researchers in those countries that help us to collect the environmental information, to analyze it, and to present it. So in 2017, we started the work on this report, looking at the links between socioeconomic inequalities and environmental hazards. And the leading questions for that report was, to what extent the disadvantaged citizens are affected by environmental hazards, and whether they are affected more than the general population. The second question was, are we doing enough at the moment through the European policy, national policy, and local actions to improve the quality of the environment of those groups? And can we actually suggest some actions how to improve this issue and how to make Europe more environmentally just through local actions and through policies? We looked at 3 types of environmental hazards in the report, and it was partly because of the really good data that we are holding on those hazards, but also because of the impacts on the health and quality of life of the Europeans. So every year, around 400,000 premature deaths are linked to air pollution. 1 in 5 Europeans are exposed to and affected by road noise. And over the course of 38 years, 80,000 deaths that were completely avoidable and completely unnecessary were caused by exposure of people to high temperatures. So we can really see a very substantial environmental impact of those hazards on people. The key findings of the report, which was done based partially on spatial analysis of socioeconomic data and environmental hazards, partly on investigation into scientific literature, partly on policy analysis. So the key findings were that yes, indeed, the people who are already disadvantaged through their age, through their health, or through their socioeconomic situation, they also tend to be the worst affected by environmental hazards. And it might be because they are more vulnerable to them, or because they're living in the environments that expose them to those hazards. The second message was that if we look at the situation in Europe, there are really, really large regional differences in terms of both the socioeconomic conditions and the environmental quality. The third observation was that even though the EU policy acknowledges that some people are more vulnerable and some people are more exposed, it does not really require a lot of action from member states on that. And the fourth message is that therefore, if we want to improve the quality of life of disadvantaged groups affected by environmental hazards, we will need targeted policy and action interventions. So the report was based on the conceptual framework that we see the biggest impacts on health when people who are vulnerable through their age, through their health, through their awareness of risks, as well through the extent of the social networks they have, through their income and education level. When the vulnerable people are exposed to environmental hazards by the environment that they live in, that they work in, or that they go to school in. And therefore, this overlap of vulnerability, exposure, and the presence of hazards really implicates high impacts on human health. Especially when we look at the urban environments, and in the context of Europe, especially Western Europe, it is in urban areas when many of the disadvantaged groups live. And they also tend to live in the closer to the city centers, in the denser urban environment with higher levels of noise, higher levels of air pollution, higher temperatures. Because of the urban heat island effect, they tend to live in areas near industry, which are additional emitters of noise, for example, whilst the people who are more affluent tend to live further away from busier roads in greener, cooler suburbs with better air quality. If we look at the environment and the European picture, we can see some overlaps between the exposure to air pollution and the socioeconomic situation. Here, the analysis was done at a regional scale. We looked at the NUTS-3 regions. They are still quite large. They're between 150,000 and 800,000 people. But we did this overlay of maps that are showing the GDP per capita. So the sort of the darker the color, the lower the GDP per capita. And we overlay that with the exposure to fine particulate matter. So this sort of crossed areas are showing the most polluted 20% of the regions. So we can see a really strong overlap in Eastern and Southeastern Europe in terms of the economic disadvantage at the regional scale and the exposure to air pollution. We also looked at the nitrogen dioxide as another type of air pollutant that causes significant harm to human health. And here the picture is a bit different. At the regional scale, we can see that the areas in dark red, which are the areas with the lowest average household income in Europe, are actually not the ones that are exposed to the highest levels of nitrogen dioxide. It's on the contrary, the regions with the seemingly best economic situation in Europe tend to be the ones that have on average the highest levels of nitrogen dioxide pollution. However, when we looked more closely at the scientific literature, it seems that even in those wealthier regions, it is the poorest communities that tend to be the most exposed to the pollution coming from industry and mainly from road traffic. So there is still this inequality and disadvantage for people who are already in difficult situations. Another hazard we looked at was the exposure to high temperatures, and this based on data produced within the European statistics on income and living conditions. And unfortunately, the last time it was done in this way was in 2012. But we can see the exposure of the population to high temperatures. It shows the proportion of people who are unable to keep their house cool in the summer. And we can see the average exposure and the exposure of the people on lowest incomes as a sort of green dot, and on the highest incomes as this purple dot. And we can see that there are not only differences between different countries. Here we have the sort of more South European countries, then relatively new member states, and then North and Western European countries. But we can also see the difference in exposure between people who are poorer and people who are wealthier within individual countries. So for example, people living in Bulgaria who are on lowest incomes are twice as likely as those on highest incomes to live in a house that is overheating in the summer, and that might cause harm to their health and to their life. Looking at the policy and action, yes, we do have a mention of vulnerable groups and their exposure to different hazards in the European policy, but it's really, it tends to be in the sort of preamble text to different policies and directives and strategies, rather than in the parts that really force member states to do something about it. So there's the observation that there are more vulnerable groups that are more exposed, but not necessarily an operational requirement to act on that. However, there is actually some local actions that are really good examples of how the quality of the environment can be improved to protect the vulnerable people. And because it's such a cross-cutting subject, there are many different policy areas that could be targeted to tackle those environmental inequalities, from improving the health and social care, as we could also see in the case of the COVID-19 crisis, but also looking at the quality of the environments, trying to minimize the emissions of pollutants and so on. So, for example, active mobility, encouraging walking and cycling. Many cities across Europe are encouraging parents to walk their children to school instead of driving them, not only to encourage the physical activity, but also to reduce the emissions from vehicles near schools. If we look at minimizing the emissions from traffic, for example, a modeling done for different cities shows that really reducing the emissions from traffic can have disproportionate benefits for the vulnerable populations living in cities, because they tend to live close to busy roads and in the sort of more denser environment. So this picture here is comparing the NO2 levels in Malmö in Sweden currently, and modeled without vehicle emissions. We can also look at the way our cities are planned, and there is, for example, an example from cities of Košice and Trnava in Slovakia, where an investigation into the vulnerability of people living in one of the districts helped to identify an area which used to be a sort of sad and neglected open space. And this area, located between a retirement house and some blocks of flats and a kindergarten, was then redesigned to really provide a cool green oasis for people to be able to use. But also looking at the health and social care aspects, for example, actions such as done in some Swedish cities or in Paris that aimed at identification of the most vulnerable people, so that when the heat wave comes, the authorities are equipped with the knowledge to be able to target those people with advice, with support, checking on them if everything is okay. What we can see is that there are some measures that could be deployed that are really not just addressing one type of environmental hazards, but many types. So encouraging active mobility and public transport, greening our cities, improvement of housing through the thermal isolation, noise reduction, the ability to keep them warm in the winter and cool in the summer, are really key areas of intervention that can help to address the inequalities. But also what's equally important is the awareness raising and encouraging the participation of the vulnerable groups in decision making, in giving them the voice to actually talk about the quality of their environments. I would like to finish with the unavoidable discussion of what it means in the context of the current crisis. And there are some really striking similarities. For example, we can see that very similar groups are vulnerable to COVID-19 and to environmental hazards. The elderly, the frail, those with pre-existing medical conditions, the lower income groups, they all emerge in the media headlines and in the emerging research as more vulnerable. When it comes to the lower income groups, it's about the ability to understand and follow warnings in some countries with lower levels of literacy, for example, due to high numbers of migrants from other countries, but also due to the living and working conditions. We can also see how the physical and mental effects of COVID-19 are being compounded by the exposure to heat and exposure to air pollution. And for example, some interesting observations from Australia, where after the really terrible forest fires came the COVID-19 pandemic, and the people who were exposed to the wildfire smoke and had their airways affected through that were those that were much more affected by COVID-19. But we can also see that in our cities, where the people exposed to air pollution are also more affected by the coronavirus. The current situation also has implications for how we operational the heat action plans. And as we are entering the summer, the temperatures are rising. Some people are still isolating in their homes that may be becoming unbearably hot. And some of the health advice given through the heatwave action plans is no longer valid, such as frequently checking on the vulnerable, using plenty of fans in a room, going to a public space which has functioning air conditioning, and so on. So that means the sort of revision of those plans so that the vulnerable populations are not affected by heat. We've also seen some short-term environmental impacts of the pandemic. There's been a bit of reduction in the greenhouse gases emissions and the reduction in air pollution, but it is too early to draw conclusions about what it means in the general scope of things, and I included in the presentation links to some resources that could be of interest on that. But I think that the really important lessons is that the longer term lessons for resilience and for equity. We've seen really how higher death toll is associated with the inequality in our society, and that we need to really focus on making our society more resilient, not just to shocks such as a pandemic, but also to the projected climate impacts, which might be even greater and even more damaging to the health and well-being than the current situation. So that's it from me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and questions.
Can you hear me? I think so. Thank you, Aleksandra, for your presentation. And if you agree, we could start by, I have some questions, so I could start with one of these. And meanwhile, if the other participants would like to write down their questions in the chat or take the floor after your first replies, I will try to aggregate them in the written ones and to manage the other ones who want to intervene later. I would like to start with an issue related also to one of the last things you mentioned in the presentation. You were talking about cross-cutting measures, and it seems that the most effective one is the one related to awareness raising and encouraging participation. By reading this, I was thinking about also your commentary article that you linked us before the webinar. And one of the interventions that could engage people in participation about this topic is citizen science. And I would like to know what are the potentialities of this kind of good practice. And I think it's important for our foundations to know more about it, because it's one of those kind of activities that we can actively promote in our communities, in our regions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question, and I think that engaging people in collecting the environmental information is one of the really best ways of raising the awareness and being able to actually feel firsthand and see the measurements on what the environment is really I think great for awareness. The agency is actually engaged in a couple of projects employing citizen science, and one of them is called Clean Air at School, where the EEA, with the network of the environmental protection agencies from, I think, 10 European countries, have installed NO2, nitrogen dioxide sensors in several schools. The project is ongoing, so I think there are more schools being involved. At the front of the school and at the back of the school, to be able to compare the levels of air pollution closer to the road and further from the road, to raise the awareness among the students, but also among the parents, and pass it on to the cities and to the countries that they live in. Something that I haven't covered in the presentation, but that is really important as well, is the sort of broader quality of the environment. For example, the presence of waste or litter and rubbish. And another initiative we are involved in is the Marine Litter Watch, which is an initiative looking at the amount of waste on the beaches on the European coast, where there is a mobile app where the non-governmental organizations and children and other people can record the amount of rubbish and the type of rubbish found on the beaches as well. But there's also loads of initiatives where we are not involved, that are, for example, done by individual cities. And a really interesting example is in the city of Prague, in Czech Republic, where citizens in one of the districts were involved in mapping the places in the district where they can see the impacts of high temperatures, where they can see the impacts of drought, for example, on the street trees or green spaces. And they could map it in a sort of participatory GIS manner using an online map to map the places. And that helped to really expose, for example, that traffic, public transport stops are really exposed to high temperatures. So the bus shelters were one of the sort of type of hotspots in the city, and that led to the city actually making them cooler, installing little green roofs and shading. And as we know, that it tends to be the more vulnerable people using public transport, the elderly, women, people on lower incomes, and so on. So it was likely to have some impact on their well-being as well. And I was told by my colleagues that the European Commission is soon publishing the best practices in citizen science for environmental monitoring as a staff working document. So that's something that's coming soon, where there will be some more information about the good practices and what is currently being done.
Thank you. I also think that in June we were supposed to have the international meeting of citizen science in Italy, in Trieste, but it was postponed in autumn. It could be an interesting event to gather more good practices to replicate them in our countries. And also we have in Italy a similar project related to the NO2 monitoring in schools, which is called, the organization who is promoting this is called Cittadini per l'Aria. I'm saying this for our Italian participants. because they are also trying to implement this monitoring activities outside Milan, where it started. This year they went outside the region and started to monitor also in other big cities around the country. So I see one raised hand by Charlotte. So you can take the floor. Okay, here you are.
Yes, hello, Charlotte. I'm working for Mercator Foundation based in Germany. Thanks for this very interesting input. I have one question which also is linked to the visibility. We spoke about citizen science as one tool to make those correlations more visible. What role do you see for social welfare organizations? How present is this issue in their structures in different countries maybe? Do you have good examples of social welfare organizations which took up this topic? And how far can they become active and make this, this topic more visible?
Okay. Could you please, thanks for the question, could you please clarify what you mean by social welfare organizations? Is it those that are concerned with, yeah, no, I'll let you explain.
Yeah, organizations which are taking care of socially disadvantaged or economically disadvantaged people, yeah, which are taking care of their daily troubles and try to support them in different ways. And do they do you think they are aware of this topic? Do they take it into account? Do they try to make it more visible vis-a-vis the political actors as well, because they are acting as advocacy associations as well, partially at least?
Yes, I'm trying to think really fast now, but it's not something that I'm very familiar with. I can think of some examples in relation to various environmental hazards, and one of them comes actually from England, and it's an organization called initiative called Snow Angels, where people who are coming to see people who are vulnerable, who are housebound during periods of extreme weather. It started from sort of winter and the snow conditions to bring them food and check on them and so on. So I think that it's really on the radar of some of the organizations. I think that especially those dealing with the elderly. And again, because I used to live in the UK, the sort of the British examples are coming to mind, but the Age UK, for example, they were also producing information on the exposure to heat and so on. So there are organizations that are active in this sector. And I think that is an important topic, but I can't think of any more examples, to be honest. But what we can see, for example, is that especially issues such as institutional care that were really hard hit by the coronavirus, and that tend to be really hard hit by also extreme weather events. It's one of those sectors or part of society that should become more aware and more active, and also in relation to air pollution, to be able to take care of the residents and the clients in an appropriate fashion.
Thank you, Aleksandra. I don't know if there are other questions. Maybe in the chat there is nothing. Maybe someone is raising their hand. Let's see. No, so we have more questions for you. And I would like to ask you this question. It's more like your opinion about the nowadays situation. You described also talking about the commentary article that we can talk about this phenomena as looking at the spatial distribution, but there is also a relevant temporal distribution, and we are talking about the impacts on our future generations. In this way, we are hearing a lot in the news about next generation of European citizens, and this is mostly related to the new proposal of the European Commission about the recovery plan, which was, by the way, named the Next Generation EU. Do you think after this crisis and what we are seeing are the steps to recover from this situation, we can see a more optimistic or pessimistic scenario talking about this kind of inequalities, environmental inequalities? I would like to add also another thing related to this. For instance, a lot of countries are taking measures to face the situation. For example, measures related to the public mobility, public transportation, and or enabling more people to go to work or move in the cities by bike, with providing new bicycle lanes, etc. These measures at the moment are mostly taken by cities and countries which have more funds to do this. And what about the countries that you showed us in the map at the beginning of the presentation, which are already in a lower socioeconomic situation? Will they be left behind in these next generation plans, or they will manage to fill the gap that we are already seeing that you showed us in the presentation? It's more like your opinion on what could be next. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's a lot of questions in one, and I'm a natural born pessimist, so my outlook on life is rather pessimistic in general. But I think that the current crisis, as awful as it has been, that it can be seen as really an opportunity to look at our society in a different way, because it has really shown what we have to lose if we don't take proper care of those who are vulnerable in the society. I think it also showed how important human solidarity is, and that if we take a moment to think about others rather than just about our immediate wants and needs, then we can really do something really meaningful together. So I think that there are some optimistic lessons that could be learned for the future. However, first of all, there is a lot of talk about resilience and so on. How long will it last? How long will the enthusiasm last? And how soon will the focus revert back to the economic issues and making sure that the macroeconomic indicators are agreeable with the politicians, and that the right number of jobs are being created, no matter how polluting in what sort of industry they might be, because the job creation might be seen as the most important. So I think it's a really mixed bag. And earlier this week I was in a meeting organized by OECD of the Climate Change Adaptation Task Force, and different countries were talking about what the current crisis means in terms of the climate adaptation in the longer term. And it was quite mixed, because for some of them they were saying that yes, resilience is on the agenda, and there is a lot of talk about the green transition and just transition, but to what extent will it actually translate into action is a different thing. About the poorer countries, I come from Poland, so that was the sort of the really dark spot on the map in terms of air pollution and economic situation. we are actually risking losing part of our recovery fund because of the mess the politicians have made with the legal system and other aspects. So there might be a sort of a double hammer in a way of not just being hit by the corona crisis, but not getting the access to the recovery funds for right reasons. And yes, you are right. It seems to be the sort of the front runner cities that are the most investing into the bike lanes. So we hear about London and Paris and Barcelona and so on, with the sort of the smaller cities or those in the regions that are poorer that may be left behind. Another example from Poland, interesting, for example, whilst the nitrogen dioxide pollutions went really down during the lockdown period because of the lower amounts of traffic. Then levels of pollution in terms of the fine particulate matter stayed more or less the same because of it being used in domestic heating and so on. So even though there was some positive impact of the crisis, it really shows that more needs to be done to actually change how people heat their homes to be able to address the pollution. So I think that in terms of drawing the attention to the old, to the frail, to the vulnerable people, we can see a big opportunity, but it really needs to be done in a sensible way to have a lasting impact on the society, on the environment, and on the economy.
Thank you, Aleksandra. And meanwhile, we have another question coming from the chat. I can read it for you. It's from Mintu from the Nestlé Foundation. And she's asking about, what about light pollution? Do you know studies about it in this context? And she's also saying that it is a theme that is rarely discussed, although studies have shown that it has negative effects on human and also other species' health. I remind the participants that in your report you didn't talk about in this presentation that you also talked about noise pollution, but I think that light pollution is not mentioned in the report. Is it right?
No, it's not, and I don't think it's actually something that we are looking at specifically in the agency. I'm trying to think now, but I don't think it's something that we do much about. So I think just thinking, what we can see in Europe is that the discrepancy between the urban and rural areas, and it seems that in Western Europe more disadvantaged people tend to live in urban areas, whilst in Eastern Europe the more disadvantaged people tend to live in rural areas. And if we think about the light pollution being mainly associated with cities, then I guess that this pattern of disadvantage could be seen more in Western Europe, where the more disadvantaged people are more exposed to the light pollution, and the wealthier ones being able to access the dark areas and those without that issue. Whilst in the Eastern Europe, it could be actually the opposite, that the people who are relatively poorer might be actually living in areas that are a bit more remote and less affected by light pollution. But unfortunately, I don't know of any specific studies in that area.
Thank you. By the way, it's also difficult, at least for me, to imagine impacts on health from light pollution. I can't recall it now in this moment what could be the impacts on health or how to investigate them. Maybe it's not easy. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's mainly the sleep disturbance and the disturbance of the daily cycle, and that might be affecting the hormonal imbalances as well, I think. Yeah. Okay. Not an expert on that, so I will shut up.
May I ask you another issue? You mentioned that apparently the rural areas are less vulnerable in the Western countries in terms of disadvantaged people. But since I deal a lot with our inner areas and the conditions in which they live, sometimes it's not completely true, of course, because the distance from services, for example, is quite important. Think about health services in this period and the distance of these services, or the transportation, or the schools, because sometimes schools are not available at a short distance. And you mentioned again the more the higher capabilities of the big cities also to reach the environment, the funds from EU, for example, in terms of sustainable mobility. In this period, for example, the Italian government presented some new incentives for big cities citizens in order to buy bicycles, e-bikes, and other new means of transport, let's say, with a high possibility of deduct from taxes part of the expense. But this possibility is not provided to small cities, citizens, and there is a high debate, of course, on this. This is, from one side, is completely acceptable, because in big cities we have the worst air pollution situations, but on the contrary, an e-bike in a rural area is probably more useful in order to counterbalance the absence of a public means of transport. So this is also an issue on which I would like to hear your opinion.
Yes, thank you. And with regards to the this situation about the disadvantage in urban and rural areas, you are absolutely right that it's very context specific, and it depends on the region and on the country. When we were preparing that report, one of the main obstacles for us was actually the availability of socioeconomic and demographic data at a granularity lower than these NUTS-free regions or the sort of general urban areas. So whilst we have the sort of detailed environmental data at a very high resolution coming from monitoring of air pollution and noise and weather and climate, we can't really match it with an equally detailed socio-economic data. That's something that we're looking at the moment, whether we can find some alternative data sources to Eurostat, for example, whether we could explore the opportunity of using market research data, which is commercial data, to actually have a bit more granularity in our assessments. Because the picture we present, of course, is on a very coarse scale, and we could see that in the case of the nitrogen dioxide, where you get completely different results when you look at the region, when you look at the city, when you look at the neighborhood. Sometimes it's even a difference between two streets in the neighborhood. So this issue of scale and the data availability for assessments is quite important. In terms of smaller cities and rural areas being able to reach the funds, yes, you're absolutely right that smaller municipalities are disadvantaged in this way, and I've seen that in the preparation of a current report that I'm working on, which is about urban adaptation to climate change in Europe, that will be published in about 3 months' time. And we looked at the ability of smaller cities and towns to access the European funds. And it's difficult because it requires, first of all, knowing that funds exist, then people who would have the time and the technical expertise to complete the very long applications. And also sometimes there is the issue of co-funding that smaller places may not be able to actually cover, and that just prevents them completely from applying for some sort of funds that require 10% or 30% of their own investment to be able to get the bigger pot of money. So I completely agree that there are difficulties there, and yeah, it's also not just in relation, for example, to accessing the financial resources, but also accessing knowledge. We looked at the participation of cities in research initiatives, for example, and the percentage is much higher among the bigger ones. Among the municipalities below 50,000 people, it was about 2% of them that have taken part in some sort of or collaborated with a research institute on environmental issues here in the context of adaptation, but it could be also relevant to others. So I think there is a really important gap there in terms of reaching the smaller municipalities, and around 30 or 40% of Europeans live actually not in the biggest cities, but in those sort of medium and small size countries. So I think it's a really good arena to investigate in terms of support.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a very important issue for us as foundation, and as this last part can be dedicated to what could be our role as foundations. You mentioned the support for growing and implementing capabilities to reach, for example, European funds. And another issue is co-funding, complementing European funds at a local level. So both these issues and these tools can be ways in which our foundations can support disadvantaged territories or groups of people.
Yes, definitely. I think that this sort of technical support in terms of helping to identify the appropriate funding and applying for funding, I think it's much appreciated. And again, I'm talking from the sort of context of climate change adaptation, but I guess it would be relevant also to other issues, and the co-funding or the match funding is another important area. I also think we talked about these cross-cutting measures, such as promoting active mobility, greening the cities, improving the quality of housing, that these are the sort of types of initiatives which can really have the social benefits, not just the environmental benefits, but social benefits for environmental groups. And of course, the awareness raising in terms of environmental issues, engaging people through citizen science or other initiatives. I think these are all areas that could get a bit of a boost, and where you could be really active.
Okay. Thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat, nor in raised hands in the participant list. So since it's also noon, I think we can finish here the webinar. And I really thank you, Aleksandra, for your insights and presentation. It's been very interesting for us, and I think we have a lot to think about in order to improve our activities in our countries. And I leave the word to Elena.
Yeah, I just want to thank all the participants, because there were very many, and very many colleagues also from Italy and from the Italian foundations, which of course it's a very good issue. And just for the closing remarks, I leave the floor to Silvia. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Aleksandra, for your presentation, Matteo and Elena for your introduction and moderation. I think was really good, and thank you all for all the participants for being here with us.